the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Mindy Wright, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees, and I facilitate the nonprofit Higher Education Alliance. It's really great to see everybody here today. Today's CMC Forum, StoryCorps in Columbus, is sponsored by GBQ and Mills James and presented in partnership with WOSU Public Media. Each are represented by many friends and associates in the audience today, so won't you please help me thank them? And now, please welcome Darcy Congrove, Managing Director of GBQ, to introduce our forum and speakers.
Thanks, Mindy. GBQ is always proud and excited to be here as a sponsor of the Columbus Metropolitan Club, where important community conversations happen and often news breaks. Today, I think we're especially excited because we've been working on a project at GBQ for the last about 18 months to talk about our firm, which is an accounting firm, not with numbers and facts and tax codes, but with stories. So we have collected almost 200 stories from our clients and our associates and are trying to do our own little version of StoryCorps. So we're especially excited today. The stories that develop here at CMC each week make a mark on Columbus, and this is the root of our conversation today. Stories passed from generation to generation provide a foundation of history, a moral compass, and an understanding of our place in the larger community. There are many examples of storytelling, from news to documentary to opera, and many styles, the limits of which are only tested by the limits of our own imaginations. Today, we are honored to hear from several champions of storytelling of the factual kind. Please help me welcome founder, Articulation, and former co-founder of TEDx Columbus, Ruth Milligan. Site manager of the StoryCorps Mobile Tour, which has been here for a few weeks now, Ahmadbeigi. General Manager of WOSU Public Media, Tom Rieland. And on her 10-year anniversary here today, the host of All Sides with Ann Fisher on WOSU Public Media, Ann Fisher. And the stage is yours.
How many among us, and thank you very much for that, how many among us have been listening to the Mueller hearings this morning? When I was listening to him, I thought, what would it be like if each lawmaker had to go into a StoryCorps booth and talk to him, you know, one-to-one, you know, with whatever ambiance you bring to it, maybe with a facilitator there to help out and how the tone might change. That's just, of course, pie in the sky, but it did get me wondering about the atmosphere of telling a story and where a story comes from and how much that atmosphere affects it. And Ava, I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you've learned about how the place matters in the telling.
Yeah, for sure. So the booth, can I just actually get a count on how many people have been in the booth or seen it? No, a couple. Oh, cool. Okay. It's a really small space. So we have a trailer in the short north, and in the back of the trailer, there's a little recording studio. There's kind of like how you would go into a diner. There's a booth in that style. And so somebody sits across the table from somebody else, and just a few feet away from you is a facilitator. And that's somebody who you don't know who is listening in on your conversation. The lights are dim. It's very intimate. There's a big microphone in front of you, not like this one. And it's kind of intimidating. But then you have this facilitator who's very familiar with the process, who is guiding you through the whole thing. And you go in there, and hopefully you're able to kind of enter this space and realize that it's an opportunity, that it's a different place for you to have a conversation that you don't normally have, and sit in the silence of that recording studio and ask a meaningful question. So that's kind of what we try to create, is this intimacy and space where people feel like, oh, this is different.
And then Tom Rieland, I wanted you to talk about a clip that's coming up now and kind of what makes it a great story and why we're going to be listening to this.
Oh, the story we're going to air here?
Right now.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Ava and the team have been providing us every week downloads of all the stories here in Columbus I want to mention that we are, once the StoryCorps Airstream leaves the short north, we are going to turn these into a StoryCorps Columbus series that starts in mid-late September and hopefully goes for about a year or so, of maybe 40 or 50 of the stories that we added up. So we appreciate StoryCorps allowing us to do that locally. And so listen for that on 89.7 NPR News. We're also going to produce a podcast related to that. So the team, every week that when Ava provides the interviews, we have about 8 or 9 people on WSU's team who have been listening to all the interviews that have been done, and then picking out initially a few of them that we think will be aired locally in September. And of course, I think probably less than 1% of the overall interviews are actually aired on NPR on Friday mornings. Is that right? That's right. So not many really make it that far, but that's okay. It's not about that. It's about telling your own story. And but we're really pleased to be able to tell Columbus's story through your stories starting in September. We have one that I'm going to do a formal introduction to because it needs a little setup. This was, I think, the first week, I believe, in the Airstream at StoryCorps.
So,
Columbus.
Rick, we might be one of the few opponents in a big Supreme Court civil rights case.
Not yet. I have to set it up.
Got a little teaser.
Boy.
Andy's quick.
I was not
If
throwing my
this was
voice.
live radio.
Wow. All right.
Here we go.
Here's the setup, Andy. Here's the 2015 U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Obergefell versus Hodges case was one of the most important in the fight for gay marriage. After Ohio real estate broker Jim Obergefell legally married his longtime partner, John Arthur, in Maryland, Arthur died of a terminal disease. Obergefell challenged the state of Ohio's refusal to recognize same-sex marriage on death certificates. The resulting landmark Supreme Court decision effectively legalized same-sex marriage in Ohio and across the country. Rick Hodges, who led the Ohio Department of Health at that time, was designated as the defendant by the state of Ohio in that case. At the Columbus StoryCorps booth, Jim Obergefell sat down with Rick Hodges to discuss the case and their resulting friendship.
So, Rick, we might be one of the few opponents in a big Supreme Court civil rights case that are actually sitting down and talking and have become friends.
Well, it was very awkward when I first found out that I was going to be on the other side of V, because I didn't want to do it. I had, as director of the Department of Health, I had a duty to defend. I took an oath to defend the law. The fact that although you were a public figure, you were on this case, this started with a personal tragedy. And I imagine at least, you probably would not have preferred not to have had to have gone through this. And I wanted to always be very sensitive and aware of that fact.
John and I, we got married and he was going to die from ALS, and we just wanted his death certificate to be accurate, and that had the potential to, like you say, bring up a whole range of emotions and political stuff. And so I've just really appreciated the fact that you're just Rick. You might be Hodges, Obergefell v. Hodges, but you're just Rick.
One question I have of you is, you are as a civil rights symbol. You are the name on the case. You had this public persona. You were actively engaged in this case. But on the same token, at the same time, this was born out of a personal tragedy. And so how were you Jim Obergefell, public figure, dealing with Jim Obergefell, private tragedy?
No, great question. And honestly, Rick, the past few months, I have found myself thinking and realizing that I'm not sure I ever really fully dealt with my grief over John's death, because from the moment he died, I traveled for quite a bit just to escape, and then the case really took over my life, and that was my life for the past 4 or 5 years, nonstop, always going. And I feel like I'm now suddenly facing John's loss. But I will say, losing the love of your life, having this fight helped because I got to talk about John every single day. And so many times people said, it must just be really painful and challenging for you to tell this story over and over and to talk about John as much as you do. And it wasn't, because for me, that helped keep John alive. I got to talk about the most important person in my world. And I also got to talk about, his loss turning into this amazing step forward for LGBTQ rights in our nation. So was it easy? I don't know that I'd say it was easy, but was it difficult? Not as difficult as I thought it would be.
That's great. Thank you. Ms. Stewart, thank you for sharing that. Ruth Milligan, what do you think makes that a great story, what you just heard?
Well, the first thing, and what's represented most there, is the tension. The best stories that we host at TEDx have the same sort of contra or conflict between what might be the hero or the villain, or in this case, you could say the defendant and the plaintiff, and the emotion that both of them have about being in that public role versus the private one is another tension that they're bringing, and you see the layers of it, and it just draws you in, and you're wrapped because the emotional connection is driven by that tension.
A lot of times things, good stories come from big events, do they not, Ava? But it's that personal take on the big event, right? Do you find that a lot?
Yeah.
I remember where I was when, kind of thing?
No, definitely. It can be big historical events, but it can also be just big life events, and that's what we get most often at the booth. And we talk about this with the facilitators who hear these conversations day in and day out, is that you hear kind of that same outline of the same story oftentimes, right? Because people want to talk about the big events in their lives and the big events of the world. And the kind of facts are going to stay the same, the way that things go are going to stay the same, but it's how that person approaches it, how they tell the story, the feelings that they have behind it, the relationship that they have with the other person sitting across from them that makes it unique. It's not just the story that's written down, it's the person. Yeah.
And I like how, I know you interviewed Dave Isay yesterday,
Right.
I think, on All Sides, and I like how Dave put it. He said, because there was a question about, the times we're in today, but really these stories are either looking at the past or the future, and a lot of times aren't about the present, right? And it's about, many of them have the same themes no matter where you go, which kind of was interesting, about love, about life, about work, about family, and those things come through in these stories. It's not about the political, where we are,
Right.
the political world today. It's about these very personal stories.
It may be 20 years from now, someone might say, where were you the night Donald Trump was elected president? But that's with perspective and a little bit different.
Or where were you when Mueller's hearings were happening? In my car, driving to the... We all remember where we were on 9/11, right?
I was surprised when I read this, but today, but Steven Spielberg famously has said people have forgotten how to tell a story. Stories don't have a middle or an end anymore. They usually have a beginning that never stops beginning. I know the challenge every day when I'm on the air trying to resolve somehow. Tom Rieland, in all your years in broadcast, what about that resolution? How do you know when you they talked for 40 minutes, Rick Hodges and Jim Obergefell. How do you know where in that 40 minutes you're finding that bit?
Well, I think you've been at this for 10 years with WSU, so I think you get it. But I think you find it. You know it when you find it a lot of times, and I think it takes some experience to do that. When you're sitting in the booth every day for listening to 140 interviews just in Columbus,
A day?
No, in a month.
Okay.
In a month, 140 interviews in a month in Columbus. You probably know when there's a gem and when it's real, when it's authentic, and when it's important.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you hear, Ava, does it kind of jump out at you? Because
Yeah.
you said you take notes, you sit by and you kind of
take
take notes to what you're listening to.
Well, it's interesting. We take notes for the archive because we archive these afterwards. We put them in the Library of Congress. So our handwriting, you can see it in the Library of Congress. But No, we do. I mean, and it's a feeling that we get too, you know? It's not like something that somebody says. It's this feeling of, oh, they just fixed that problem that they've been working at for years, or like, oh, that's a question that daughter needed to ask her father, you know? It just is in the room, it's in the vibe of the room, and then hopefully later on when you listen to it, you can hear it in the words as well. But it's something that you feel with the people in the atmosphere.
And, you know, Ruth, when you're coaching people, whether it's for TEDx or whether it's one of your, you know, big shot executives that you coach, how do you know what makes a story for them?
That's a big question.
Is it sometimes a word, or is it a...
Sure, well, let me share one thing that someone told me once, just building on this. For those of you, many in the room may remember Barbie Tootle. She's still around. She was Gordon Gee's speechwriter. About 10 years ago when we started TEDx, and I was looking for someone to help us be a story coach and realized there weren't many around, I went to her and I said, you know, tell me what you've learned over the years, and, you know, 90 minutes or less. And she said the hardest part for people always in their story, regardless of how sophisticated or experienced you are, is getting in and getting out. And so it's to this point of how do I, at what point in the journey do I know where to start it and where to finish it? And so in the story you just heard, there's many parts of that story that they could have told. When you think about the whole story arc, that's a different one than maybe just the Supreme Court case and how that started and finished. And it's a matter of how you're curating it. In our case, as to what piece makes the difference for the audience at that time. In our case, we're looking for an idea. So often it's, where did you get that idea, is where we start. What was the moment in time you knew you were going to cure this or do this? And let's pull that out, and then kind of where can you leave the audience with something they can do is always where we try to finish the story to make it back about you so that you can have something to take away and learn from, do, or be inspired for. So in the case of our storytelling, that's always what we're trying to do, is to bring it back to you. That may not always be the case in the StoryCorps because it's so intensely personal between those two people.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point too, is there's storytelling and then there's why you do it, right? It changes so much depending on what your purpose is, what your mission is behind the storytelling. I mean, for us, it's so much about, like, yes, our mission is to preserve and share humanity's stories, but it is so much about the experience that people have coming into the booth, the experience of telling the story and the experience of listening. And then there is something additional to that when we share it with NPR or WOSU, you know, and you're able to kind of communicate it out and share it with people. But storytelling has so many different functions, you know.
For sure. We'll say people that have given talks on the TEDx stage will say they will never speak the same way again. I don't know if that's good or bad. And it opens up 1,000 doors for them if they look for them, if they choose to move through that. So there's probably closure and then doors open for Jim and Rick after they talk, just like you would share a story, especially when you're willing to be vulnerable and share something you haven't shared before. That's really always a turning point in a story, is when you really sort of reveal your truths.
You know, going back to that Spielberg remark that people have forgotten how to tell a story, that's kind of part of our mission at WOSU, is it not, Tom Rieland? It's part of StoryCorps' mission. It's part of Ruth Milligan's mission. How do you feel about that people have forgotten how to tell a story? Or not that they have forgotten how to tell a story.
I think it's an interesting, how many here have actually listened to a podcast? Let me ask that. How many have? Boy, almost everybody here has listened to a podcast. About 50% of our population has actually listened to a podcast in America as of today. But there are I think it's 30 million now stories on podcasts. There are about 750,000 programs out there of podcast programs. A lot of people are telling stories and using podcasts to do it. And a lot of those podcasts, are related to storytelling. And if you think about TEDx and TED Talks, a really outstanding podcast. You think of The Moth, you think of This American Life, which really kind of kicked it off almost 2 decades ago. there's a lot of storytelling and a lot of technology, and now anybody can start their podcast and create their own stories. So I think when you say that, I think there are a lot of people telling stories and a lot of access to different types of stories. Now, I'm not sure if people are telling their story more now than in the past, but I think the technology is allowing them to do that. StoryCorps is allowing you to do that with an app as well, to tell your stories.
It's almost kind of like we're hardwired, though, to want to tell stories and listen, too. I mean, before, the internets and TV and radio, that's what we used to do. We used to talk to each other. I mean, meaning that's how we're kind of wired. I mean, most of the history of human existence has been talking to each other and listening to stories. So I wonder about, and Ruth, you're probably the best person to ask about this, how the where and the how changes the what. So it's one thing to be in the booth with the facilitator at StoryCorps. It's another thing to be interviewed by a professional journalist for, whether it's, Broad and High or Columbus Neighborhoods at WOSU. But, you talk to people who are going to be talking to analysts who are paying attention to their company, and you also prepare people to speak in front of 500 or 1,000 people at a TEDx event.
Well, I think it goes back to what Ava was saying too, the purpose, right? There's always a goal of your communication or telling your story, and we always start there. What do you want people to do after they hear your stories? The first question we always ask. What do you want to inspire people? And so that then helps to draw out the content and the structure. But the process of at least TEDx is a little different because there's no editor per se. It's just them. Now, there's a lot of editing and coaching that goes on getting up to that point. But you can go on stage, we give you 10 or 15 minutes, you may choose to say something else, and we can't stop you. We might not post your talk online later. We do reserve that right. But, Dante Woods Spikes was a really good example of somebody who came to us and he's said this on record many times, no way will TEDx accept me. And my story about working with boys in the inner city and being heard and seen and, in fact, he was the favored story of that year, and we put him at the last spot because it was so compelling, and it sort of blew his mind that we would elevate that. But that's the whole point about storytelling, is that it should be democratized and that everybody gets the same stage and the same audience and the same 10 or 15 minutes, and there's no sort of hierarchy of where you sit, or we may make sure that not everyone in the same subjects are next to each other in the lineup of our live program. But that's what we love about it, is that it does allow George Barrett, the CEO of Cardinal, to be on stage next to Dante Woods Spikes, who didn't even know who he was and didn't care, maybe then or now, I don't know. No offense to George, but everyone gets that fair shake, and that's without story that wouldn't have happened in our mind.
Speaking of Dante and what he said, like, why would anyone want to hear my story? I wondered, Ava, if you get that very often where someone's dragging some relative into the booth and they're like, I'm telling you, nobody cares. I don't know why you want to talk about this. Does that happen because people tend to denigrate and first self-edit, shut themselves down?
Yeah, definitely that happens. Definitely there's kind of a downplaying of who cares about my story. But it's also like we try to make them understand it's not, you're not telling us a story so that WSU will produce something out of it. Like, you're telling us a story so that the person you're sitting across will know your story. And then through the experience of actually talking about it and, being asked a question, being shown that, oh, I care about you, realizing that somebody wants to listen to them, that their story matters to that person, and that it matters to the facilitator, that it matters enough to be archived as a part of American history, it matters enough to go to WOSU, they kind of walk out of it being like, oh, okay, like I didn't have to have some kind of big historical kind of story to tell. My story's enough. Yeah.
Ava and I were talking just a few minutes ago, and I think unless you're in this environment, and it is a really cool environment. First of all, it's nice and it's quiet, and I guess it's quiet on the short north right now, right?
Well, there's a lot of construction.
And when you have that experience, it's quite different than sitting in your living room with your cell phone on and being interrupted and talking to your grandfather or grandmother or something, or a relative. And it's everything about coming to this special place, right? And I think David Isay called it a sacred space, really, where you come, you have this special moment where you're all focused on each other, you have a time to listen, you have time to think and talk, and there's no interruptions. And you've made an appointment to do this, which is important too. It's intentional, and I think that's what makes it really special too.
Yeah.
Just a quick note on that appointment piece. We have we've watched throughout the last 10 years that no one really shows up unless there's a date and a time and a place. They don't show up with their vulnerabilities or their full selves, or they don't practice, or they don't really until that moment happens. We call them consequential moments. People will ignore it, cancel, reschedule. Not important for me to tell it, or practice, or whatever the thing might be. But there's a lot of adrenaline and inertia that comes with that moment that doesn't happen if it doesn't happen. I mean, it's a significant part of bringing this story out.
That's
is
true.
Knowing that that's the moment I'm going to do it.
Yeah. And I mean, I will tell you, there's a lot of like having to calm people down once they get in the booth, especially when they like sit down and you put the microphone down in front. People like take a step back, and I'm like, no, I'm going to do a sound check first. You're going to get used to this first. And then we'll talk about like who's starting, who's asking the first question. People are so kind of like, especially when they're coming in raw and vulnerable, they are so nervous to be in that space, and it's such a privilege to be able to be with them there and remind them that, this is 40 minutes, it's going to be okay. Yeah. I promise. And we're here for you.
I think the adrenaline thing's interesting because I go through that every day.
Bet.
I drive in thinking, what were they thinking? And then the next thing I know, the show's over with. It's just because you just have to show up and do it. Well, first, I want to move. We're going to move to the audience questions in a few minutes. So please step up to the microphone. It's the little tiny black thing over there, antenna-like thing. Don't be shy.
Small one.
But I want to get to just one kind of final thought, and it sort of goes with the issue of another thing that Dave Isay said yesterday, which is that geography doesn't matter. And it reminded me of a writing workshop I do where I tell people to just write about their favorite dessert, and how no matter what that favorite dessert is, the story ends up being about a memory, usually of a mother or a grandmother, and that there are these universal themes so much that are a part of our lives that connect us so much more than we realize.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like so interesting that you bring that up, because one of the most common questions we get in StoryCorps is why here? Why this city? Why did you choose us? Why are we special? And like every place is special in its own way, but it is also thinking about StoryCorps' larger mission. It's to collect the stories of all Americans, right? And to kind of democratize it, like Ruth was saying, that everybody gets this opportunity to share their story. And for us, listening to all of them, it's kind of like trying to put puzzle pieces together, but it's so difficult. It's such a hard puzzle because people are telling their intimate, personal stories that's the same every time. It doesn't matter where you go. It's about family. It's about relationships. But through that, you hear about this person grew up on a farm, and in Philadelphia, people grew up in the city. It's like trying to piece together the history of this country and the identity of the city and states through people's personal, intimate stories. And that's a difficult thing to do, right? So I always have a difficult time explaining to people why we chose to come to a particular place. But thank you for kind of starting that with it's all in the personal. People have the same story.
I'm very proud to say that I gave them my business card at a conference in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago. And they called me a year later and said, what do you think? You want to do it? And I said I had to move it up the food chain, up to the likes of Tom Rieland. But
So you should know that StoryCorps' first run through the country was 2005 with the Streamline, and they came to Columbus in 2005. I don't know if any of you were part of that.
At the State House, right?
At the State House lawn. And it took 14 years to get them back, because of Ann Fisher probably. So we don't want to wait another 14 years. So.
Ruth? Oh, okay. Well, let's get to the questions then. It is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name and ask your question. Please avoid editorial comments. And remember, questions end with a question mark. So let's get started. First question, please.
It is a storytelling session, but
Yeah.
we'd like questions today.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Fox with the Pizzuti Companies. And my question is primarily for Ava, but I would be interested if either Tom or Ruth in their respective roles have an answer as well. What is the most surprising story that you've heard through your work?
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting because there isn't ever a story that that is just on its own. You know, like it comes up over and over again, right? I'd like to say it's kind of a really crazy story between a teenage son and his mother, like confronting her about really serious issues that they have in this booth where she's not prepared to deal with it. Like that for me was surprising, but it's not the first time it's happened, right? And that is also what's so special about this project, is that it reminds the people who are listening to the stories and who are aware of what's going on that like no one is alone, right? No story, no circumstance kind of is isolated in and of itself. Wherever you go, you're going to hear the same situation, the same circumstances, just in a different form. So I'm sorry if I can't answer.
No surprises, okay.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
Ruth?
I could talk on forever about surprising stories we've hosted. I couldn't even begin to start, but where people are willing to bring incredible stories to our stage that they've never shared before. And it's slightly different because they're not conversations. They're not like revealing themselves to each other as they're going along. But suffice to say, just check out any
podcast of
Yeah,
TEDx. Thank
very
you.
good.
Hello, my name is Carol Looper, and I was a TV and radio reporter for more than 35 years, and I interviewed lots of people, and some of them the interviews went 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and it was never very easy to find the 10, 15, 20-second soundbite that would make the story. I'm wondering, how do you choose which stories to use?
I think that's a WOSU question.
Wow, yeah. Well, luckily we have longer than 15 seconds, Carol. You know, and we're learning as we go. Obviously, we listen every Friday morning on 89.7 NPR News at 8:25 in the morning to listen to the NPR version of StoryCorps, and we learn a lot by listening to that. But you know, StoryCorps does a lot of those a little bit different style. They don't just, sometimes some of those are not directly from the StoryCorps booth, but they actually call people back in for a follow-up interview sometimes during those. So there's little secrets that they have that we're learning about. But you know, we're all listening and learning. And the one you heard today was a very difficult cut, I think, for us, because it was a big case and we had to try to get it very personal over under 3 minutes or so. So we do have a little bit more than 15 seconds, but we're just learning on the job. But I mean, I think all of us know a good story when we hear it, and we're trying to pass that on to the community. Thank you.
George O'Donnell. And there was a lovely plug you gave the event today in the closing minutes of yesterday's interview of Dave, the founder of StoryCorps. Ava, I've been wanting to coordinate a meeting between yourself, perhaps, and a 92-year-old, very articulate aviator. I mean, from single engine to multi-engine jet. His last gig was working as a pilot for Leslie and Abigail Wexner. Is this something that you would have an interest in hearing about?
So we should talk afterwards about that. What, absolutely.
Well,
Right.
I'll have Don Peters' son, or I'll take care of coordinating an interview before you leave town.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
Hi, I'm Lori Moffett, and I'm a friend of Ruth's, so I'm really glad to be here. My question is really to any of the panelists. What do you think of like Instagram story and all these like tools that are out there that are, you know, these 20-second stories that are coming out, or a 24-hour cycle? Like, I'm just curious what your take is on these new tools.
With the risk of embarrassing her, I might pass this question to my 15-year-old daughter who's sitting in the audience.
Let's have her come up and answer it.
You want to try?
Oh, yeah. They're great, but they're, I mean, I think it just all goes back to why are you telling a story, right? Like, if you're trying to, it's a great tool for communication, Instagram, but it's fast, it's not deep, you know? You don't have a chance to engage with things in a meaningful way. And that's fine for certain things. But for relationships and for like communicating a story that matters deeply to someone, sitting down is the best way to do it. Yeah.
I think Ava says it very well. I think that also it's always experience. It's like instant experiences that they're involved in and that they're trying to share with people. And that's quite different than what we're talking about, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they're connecting in certain ways and disconnecting in others, quite frankly, in my experience.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bill Lafayette. I'm an economist and I own Regionomics. And I've been sitting there reflecting on the 60 years of stuff that I've been through. And my question is, how would one take an event or a process or something and make a compelling story of it? What do you pick?
Ruth?
Yeah, Ruth.
Let's talk about
Throw it to Ruth. Kicking that to Ruth.
It's what we call hot seat. So give me a little more detail. What would be the intention?
For
I'd always-
example.
Or an example. I always start with, what's the intention?
Well, the intention would be simply to share a piece of my life, or maybe professionally, maybe personally. I don't really know. That's kind of why I asked.
I have one, so people come to us in kind of 3 different categories of story when they want to give a TEDx talk. And one of them is, I have an idea that I've authored, it's my own IP. The other is I have an observation, I'm a trend watcher. And the third is I've had this very interesting experience. And so if I put that in that bucket, right, in my own kind of way I organize things, I always say I'm not really interested in, this is me personally saying, I'm not really interested in your journey, like every step along the way, but let's find the most memorable or meaningful moments and see if they connect in some sort of thematic way. And that you might come up with 3 or 4 moments that then have that tie that says this is the story theme that I want to bring forward. Because the journey of I started here and then I did this and I did that, nobody really wants to hear that. Right, there's not enough time in the year. But and that theme may play differently if the audience is different, the moment is different, the event is different. You might come up with, if the artist in you wants to talk about your best 4 paintings, or maybe it's the marathons that you ran, right? You have different stories inside you to curate in those small ways. And so that's what I would say is, who are you giving the story to? Because there's listeners usually. And what do you want them to impart?
Hi, my name is Melissa Weber. I'm a writer in Columbus, and my question is, and it's kind of a follow-on from Kathy's question, actually. So it's not so much, have you been surprised by people's conversations, but do people surprise each other? Is it a legitimate, I've not told you what question I was going to ask you, or do you think sometimes they have prepared in advance?
Definitely, they have prepared in advance.
Okay.
You said definitely they have?
Definitely they have. People show up with sheets of questions that they have. Listen, we don't direct it in any kind of way. That's kind of, that's part of the freedom and beauty of what StoryCorps does, is like, here's a space, we've made it, it's free, take it. Like, it's yours to do with what you want. So yeah, some people will come in with a script and read it. But other people come in and they're like, I don't need your help. I don't need you to like know what I'm talking about. I'm just gonna ask you a question that I've been meaning to ask you, and I haven't had the chance to, or I haven't had the courage to. And the other person, you know, it kind of depends how they deal with it, who they are. Sometimes they're caught off guard. They're like, oh, like let me deal with this, you know. And sometimes they're like, oh, thank goodness you asked that. I've been meaning to talk with you about it. So it just, there's such a large variety, you know. It's also part of course, it's also part of why it's so hard for you guys to edit it down.
Right, exactly.
Hi, Kimber Perfect, and another question for Ava. What percent, I know you give people the option of just taking their tape, not sending it on to Library of Congress, not using it for NPR. And I'm curious how many people just come in, have the conversation, and then just want to have that tape and not do anything else.
I will say maybe like 3 out of 140 that we have out of a stop.
Okay.
It's very rare. You know, if you're going to put yourself out there in that way, chances are you want it to be shared. You want it to kind of be saved somehow. But yeah, I mean, of course, there are a handful of people every stop we go to that decide, you know, this isn't for anybody else. This is for me.
I think it's wonderful that you have that as an option.
Thank you.
Because it really does provide that safe space. Thank you.
I asked, when I was talking to Dave Isay yesterday, I did say that, you know, now we look back at public records, you know, everyone's into genealogy to one degree or another, or we get our DNA done or whatever it is, but what's going to be like 50 or 100 or 500 years from now if we're still here, when you can go back and you can actually hear these voices from the past talking about, I wish I could live to be 100 so that I could do that.
Yeah.
And have that kind of context. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is John McKnight. And I'm sitting here listening to you talk, thinking of a lot of conversations that I would like to have or that I should have with some people that are close to me. And they're conversations that I haven't had because they're difficult. You know, there's something holding me back. Why does StoryCorps work? If I'm afraid to have this conversation in the privacy of my own living room with somebody, why in the world am I going to go put it on air? And I love the show, so I don't mean that to sound, you know, negative against it in any way, but what is it about StoryCorps that compels people to come in and share the deepest stories that maybe they couldn't have, you know, over their own kitchen table?
I mean, listen, it absolutely is so scary to bring somebody into that place. I think part of it is you are kind of what Ruth was saying before, like you do have to show up to a thing. You know, you make an appointment and you have to show up to it. And actually the beginning of that conversation starts with you asking the person to even come in with you, you know? Then they know, oh, I need to talk about something. And then they get themselves prepared. It's not kind of a random dinner conversation where you're like, you know what, now's the time for us to talk. They have had time to prepare. You have had time to prepare. And we always say people bring their best selves to the booth because they know they're being recorded. They know they're being watched. And so you're behaved. Everyone is behaved. And it's scary to have somebody else in the booth, but we try as much as we can, especially when there's a conversation that really needs to happen, to kind of disappear into the background. And a lot of times when people get into the space where they're having the conversation they want to have, they feel us disappear.
You know, Ruth, Milligan, some of the best TEDx stories have been super personal. People revealing extremely personal. I think one of the most famous, at least in my book, is the former heroin addict who shared incredibly intimate details about her demise and then, of course, her recovery. But how do you get people to do that? It's one thing to be sitting in a booth, and I'm just wondering about getting people to do that in front of, I don't know how many people go to TEDx Columbus anymore. It's a gazillion.
Not-
Right? Is that a
Not
real-
quite a
that's a cool
gazillion,
number,
but just quickly so we can get to the other questions, the person you're talking about, Crystal Ortley, nominated herself to give a talk at her sister's encouragement through her, she was in recovery. She was a 13-year heroin addict. And we recognize when those folks come to us that there's probably a parallel path happening where they're still on recovery, but they want to come and be vulnerable and be open about it. And we have to really balance a delicate walk because sometimes they're fully not ready to come and tell their story. Or, and in that case, it was the first time she'd ever told her story, and it was in front of 1,000 people. The most, she'd never spoken in front of a group more than 4 or 5. And that story propelled her in many places, including a panel with President Obama with only one other recovering addict to talk about her experience. She really put herself out there, but it was part of her process. So we recognize sometimes we're in that recovery with them. It's always not safe or a place we want to be, but in that case, and I'm sure you have that too, Ava, where you've got people in recovery of their relationships and their own stuff happening right in front of you. And it's a privilege and an honor and a delicate place to be, and you're really observing that.
Oh, absolutely.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. Thank you. Two more. We have 2 more questions. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Bell with Phoenix Consulting Company, and I'm a avid listener of All Sides with Ann Fisher.
Thank you.
An avid listener of WOSU. I love TEDx Columbus, and I listen to StoryCorps. I hear a lot of healing when I hear all of these stories on all of the programs. And Ava, your undergraduate degree, you studied memory and identity. And I'm curious to know how you see that intersection, that interplay occurring in the stories that you hear, and what else might you see as the opportunity for us all to do something with that? Because memory and identity, I think it just rings really important, and I think especially right now. So where do you see that intersection, and what else can we be doing with that?
Yeah. So much to think about there. I haven't even thought about how my undergrad experience comes into this job. I think what I studied in undergrad in terms of memory and identity is how memory is passed down between parents and grandparents and children, and then how that kind of sharing of memory forms the identity of the person that is hearing these stories and is kind of building a lifeline for themselves beyond their own life, right? Choosing to identify with their parents and things like that. And there is, that's very clearly, I think, linked to oral history and the project of StoryCorps in some ways, of this is a tape for your children to listen to. And this is something for them to be able to understand where they come from. But there's also, there's a playing out of memory and identity in this space itself, right? It is kind of going back to this place of, this is an intensely vulnerable thing for people, and you can't expect for people to be coming in already having resolved all of their issues. I don't think people resolve their issues even until the day they die. It's ongoing, right? And so I think that kind of plays out, having to recall something in the booth, having to kind of deal with it with this other person, is certainly a process of kind of uncovering and healing. And to your question of what more can we be doing with it, if you have anything to say about this, the other panelists, I feel like what's most important to me on the StoryCorps end of it is that we are continuously providing a space for people to be able to have that conversation. And that's hard work. And so the better we can do it, I'm the happier I am, that's all I want from my team.
Ava, I wonder if you could talk about the StoryCorps app for a minute, because that's another way people can be outside the booth and still tell their story, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, because we only do get to do 140 interviews, every stop that we go to, and there are obviously far more stories to be told in every city than that. We have this app that you can download on your phone or iPad or any kind of tablet. And you are able to kind of go in there, look at the greatest questions list that we have compiled, and ask each other questions and record it on your phone and upload it straight onto the app, and it goes from there, if you want it to the Library of Congress, and is able to be archived in the same way that we archive the rest of our conversations. So check that out. It's got a lot more details to it, but it's certainly a tool.
Thanks for your attention today. Appreciate it.
Well, I hope you all found today's forum as interesting as I did. I suspect you all did. Let's thank our sponsors, GBQ and Mill James, and WOSU Public Media. And our speakers, Ruth Milligan, Ahmadbeigi, Tom Rieland, and Ann Fisher. And thank you to all of you for being here. We hope to see you next week.